to you.
Hello, and welcome to this wild and wonderful and hopefully not too wet event at Lighthouse Books. With me here today, we've got Victoria Bennett at the end, whose debut book, All My Wild Mothers, is a kind of war and vulnerable memoir bringing together her experiences with her knowledge of herbal medicine. And Kerri Dochartaigh, whose second book, Cacophony of Bone, recounts kind of an isolated year spent in a remote railway competition island during the pandemic. These are two very brilliant and very different pieces of nature writing, but both of them kind of hold space for these really big emotions, for really big topics. So it's like a real privilege to be talking to both of you about your books today. So I think to start, Victoria's going to read from All My Wild Mothers.
If I could juggle the microphone to the book for the scarf. Hello. So each of the chapters in the book are introduced through a plant. This one is common house leek, Sempervivum tectorum, healing blade, homewort, imbrose, thunderplant. Grow house leek on your rooftop to protect against storms. Common house leek was traditionally grown in the walls of the home to protect against thunderstorms, fire, and witchcraft. Its botanical name, Sempervivum, translates as always alive. The young shoots and leaves are edible and taste similar to cucumber. With anti-inflammatory properties, it's widely used in herbal medicine as a poultice to treat burns, scalds, ulcers, shingles, conjunctivitis, and other skin and eye conditions. Common house leek grows well on rocky ground, walls, rooftops, and broken buildings. The estate is a strange enclave of suburban planning in the middle of agricultural land. A cul-de-sac of matching houses facing inwards around a communal green. Half the site is given over to social housing, built to provide homes for those who cannot afford to live anywhere else. The other half is earmarked for those who can buy into the dream of building their own home. Set up by the local community trust, it is heralded as a successful example of big society ideology. David Cameron's photo hanging proudly above the bar in the local community-owned pub. It is a curious and uncomfortable juxtaposition of aspiration and lack. Yet for all its newness, there is a history hidden under its ground. Once an industrial stoneworks, for over 150 years it produced the stone for hearths and homes. When it closed in 2004, it left behind the debris of a life, weathered buildings, deep slurry holes, mangled metal, asbestos, and rock. This is what lies buried below our home. It is here that my son and I decide to create our magical garden. I'm not a gardener, at least not in the sense of what I think a gardener should be. I do not plant at the right time or dig where I'm meant to dig. I do not know what should go where and what should not be planted. My gardening is haphazard, born from curiosity and chance. But here in this disturbed and broken ground, I need to believe that new life can grow. The idylls of my mother's magazines are beyond our means. The Bloomsbury Group gardens of Sackville West, Wolf and Bell remain in the books on my shelf. This will be no Sissinghurst, Monk's House or Charleston, though I love them all. This garden will be wild, but it must also be cheap and thrive in rocky and poor soil. From our old house we have carried seeds, a blackcurrant bush and a potted horse chestnut, given to me by the wild women when I was pregnant and afraid of losing another child. They told me to plant the conker, and like the chestnut tree, my child would grow strong. Since that day I have tended it, taking it with us through each move, planning to plant it out when we have a place of our own. Meanwhile, the tree still grows. Now the sapling is 2 feet tall. The sapling is 2 feet tall and sits outside the door of our new home, swaddled in a large terracotta pot. For the rest of the garden, we look to the rudderall weeds that grow beneath our feet, their name coming from the Latin word rudus, meaning rubble. These are the pioneer plants that take root where all else is waste. The overlooked weed that grows feral at the edge of things, between pavement cracks and borderlines of otherwise respectable lands. It will not be contained. The dictionary defines a weed as a wild plant growing where it is not wanted, and yet who decides its fate? Unlike other wildflowers, the common weed has a codependent history of human interference. cultivated and cast out in equal measure over the years. This history is hinted at in the names whispering of magic and medicine, food and folklore, the botanist's herbarium, and the wise woman's spells. These tenacious seeds were once prized and harvested for their ability to feed, heal, clothe, and colour. From the earliest documented medicinal garden in the Abbey of St. Gall in Switzerland, established during the reign of Europe the Emperor Charlemagne, to the world-renowned Chelsea Physic Garden founded in 1673 by the Worshipful Society of Apothecaries, the power of weeds and wildflowers has been a part of medicine, sanctioned by physicians of both state and church. At the same time, those who practiced herbal medicine outside the confines of these sanctioned walls were deemed witches, tortured, hanged, or burned. Nearly 200,000 people were murdered this way during the witch hunts in Western Europe, the majority women. I can't help but wonder what medicine might have been had the wise women been respected instead of persecuted, burned, and drowned. But for each thing a rise and fall, the apothecary garden put what was known behind walls, but it could not be contained, and the monasteries would come to ruin. When they did, the plants that were once prized pushed beyond the boundary line and found their way back to the wild. Its value forgotten, the weed, like the wise woman, became something to be eradicated and reviled. Now, as nature has homogenized, the garden becomes a tidy lawn, a parking space, plastic grass. The fields that once held a pharmacy are claimed by industrial agriculture and the privatization of land. Over the last century, we've lost 97% of our native wildflower meadows to the machinery of supply and demand. The little weed moves ever outwards, rooting itself into spaces nobody wants to claim. I think about this unloved plant, how furious its will to hold on, how resolute the life it seeds. Yet the weed is only a weed if it is unwanted. Like the monks, my son and I will seek them out and grow an apothecary in our garden. Maybe in time, its medicine will heal. My mother-in-law gives us a yellowing copy of the Collins Wildflowers of Britain and Northern Europe. With it to hand, my son and I head out onto the building site to see what we can find. Between the rubble, we discover plantago, dandelion, speedwell, mullein. I find an old copy of Culpepper's Complete Herbal in a second-hand bookshop and begin to teach my son about the signature of plants. But if we look closely, they will show us what we need. Together we learn about permaculture techniques and the principles of sustainable gardening. We research hugelkultur beds and find out that by using common biomass from fallen beds, this is such a long chapter, sorry. From fallen wood to kitchen compost, we can make a self-sustaining nutrient bed that will hold moisture and heat and build fertile soil for a decade to come. As we learn about weeds, we find out about the importance of backyard biodiversity. The RSPB State of Nature report tells us the UK has lost 72% of its butterfly species. My son worries about this. I tell him we can be the change we want to see. We add in plans for ponds and bog gardens to provide a habitat for amphibians and thirsty bats, wood piles, bug hotels, and dead hedges for insects and hedgehogs to hide in, wildflowers and long grasses for butterflies and bees, berry bushes, wild strawberry patches. Every day my son draws these treasure maps through wondrous lands, conjuring our garden into being, while I rip up old gardening magazines, adding hollyhocks and lavender to his dreams. When I tell the wild women of our plans, they gift us books on tree medicine, flower wisdom, and hedge witchery, their knowledge deeply sown, now passed on to me. Over the years, these friends have become kin, quietly nurturing the small seeds of my life. I have seen their children grow, and they have helped mark the losing and birthing of mine. It is right that they should be part of this garden we grow. As the year turns its final quarter, our imagined garden begins to take shape. But first, we must dig out what lies beneath. It's a very long chapter, but kind of gives the entire history of the garden. I haven't thought about that one.
But beautifully read, and actually leads me nicely into my first question for you both, which is that so gardens were so integral to both of your books. So I was hoping that I could ask both of you about the process of gardening as a sort of act of helping you heal, and what that kind of meant to you, the part of the story.
Yeah. I've just told you about most of the garden. So, to give a bit of context to that, we'd moved into a new social housing estate that had just been built, and I was deeply in grief, and I was still am a carer of my son, he has medical needs, and we were very in debt and struggling to make ends meet, and it just felt like everything died, everything was broken, and the ground that we were faced with was a newly sown lawn over rubble and rock and mess, and I needed to see what would grow, but we had no money, and so I went for what we could grow, which was the weeds that were grown on the building sites that the housing estate hadn't really finished. So that's what my son and I started to grow our garden with. But obviously, as soon as we stuck a spade in the garden, we discovered that everything underground was rubble and rock and mess and nothing you wanted to plant in. So the only things that would grow there were the things that would grow in broken ground. That's, in doing so, it taught me how to do the same, I think, as well.
It's so gorgeous. It's really beautiful to hear you read from your really beautiful debut. Gorgeous question. So gardening is a big part of Cacophony of Bone, and I suppose like you, I was dealing with an awful lot of grief and trying to make peace with being childless, not by choice. So kind of a long battle, not battle, we shouldn't use that word when we're talking about fertility or anything really, a long dialogue with working through that grief. And we moved into the house, the cottage that Cacophony of Bone is set in predominantly, just after winter solstice, just before the pandemic began. And we inherited a garden of rubble and brambles and bracken in boglands where almost nothing grows. And my partner, we had moved there so that I could make peace with this childlessness, and so that I could tend to words instead of to a baby. My partner, as part of that sort of healing for me, cleared the whole garden back. And I'm someone who has lived alongside a lot of loss, in particular loss of place. So I've moved around a lot, not by choice. And so I suppose it was my first garden that I'd been allowed to tend to. And yeah, like you, it's very cliched, and that's fine. That's really fine. Cliche is fine when it comes to issues of the heart and soul. But in clearing the garden and then sowing, I learned to work through my grief, and then actually became pregnant in the midst of tending to the garden. And so I suppose Cacophony of Bone explores how one lives alongside grief, both inherited and intergenerational and personal and climate grief, and how one tends to land at a time when land is so political and really needs, when land really needs decolonizing, and when land needs healed, and when the key and kin that we share. So key is a phrase, Robin Wall Kimmerer uses it to, instead of saying it of a tree, we say key. So how do we live alongside the things that are in our garden when we carry so much trauma, we carry so much responsibility in the midst of climate crisis, housing crisis, race crisis, gender crisis, human crisis? And I suppose Cacophony of Bone tries to speak for those unborn things.
Thank you so much for such a thoughtful answer of both of you. I guess kind of leading on from that, I'd sort of love to hear what you think about what it is about not just gardens, but the natural world more broadly, that seems to offer this space for holding these kind of really big emotions, really big feelings, you know, that sort of draws people to want to write about their experiences within that kind of framework.
So shiver a bit. I don't
You in my shirt?
No, I'm not. I think I'm cold. I think I'm nervous. So I sound like I'm really cold. Just fine. I'm just a little bit nervous. I didn't actually set out to write a nature book. No, it wasn't. I had no concept of myself as writing nature writing. I was just writing, and that was my will. So I forgot. That's my answer. I was just going to say about the Dan Shepherd Prize, that because I got longlisted that, and that changed the way that I saw the book, but in a way that was quite an important thing, because I wanted to enter. I decided I was going to enter because it's free for one, and I thought, okay, it is about trying to support underrepresented voices, and so I wanted to have a go. So I was trying to write what I thought was nature writing. It was crap. It was totally crap. So because I wasn't feeling it. I wasn't there. So I was writing what I thought was supposed to be nature writing, but it couldn't be my story, because I was at home and I was looking after a small child, and I was looking after elderly parents, and I couldn't wander off on some pilgrimage to a remote place and find all my way through things. I just had to do it where I was doing it. So I had been writing all of these pieces. I've been writing these short bits when I had moments, just to try and capture my life and these moments in my life. And I kind of said to my friend, my partner, that well, could I end? What about this? I've got this, I suppose. And I was working with a mentor at the time, and I'm like, yeah, put that in. But who would want to read about my little life? Was actually the phrase that I used. I'm just here. I'm just doing this, and then I thought I would want to read about that, so I'll put it in. And then, of course, getting longlisted meant it made me re-see what I was writing and see that, in fact, the nature that I experienced, the weeds beneath my feet, the ground beneath my feet, the rubbish ground, the rubbish land, and the insecurity, you were saying about the insecurity of ground, all of these things, that was as much nature writing as what I perceived. And in fact, that was a nature writing that spoke more for me. So it changed the way that I then saw how I wrote, and actually how I saw my life, which was
That's such a brilliant answer. And yes, so the concept of nature writing is an interesting one. And I suppose I'm wary to say this, but I will. It is an inherently white colonial violence concept, because as soon as we begin segregating the way in which we interact with the natural world, we bring in all of the ideology around, well, why do we feel so separate? Why is it the same as sports, memoir, etc., whenever the natural world is literally our home, is literally us? And so actually writing about hearing is the natural world, writing about birds is the natural world, writing about geology is the natural world, and these all coexist. Writing about our gut flora, or pregnancy, or matrescence, the journey into becoming a mother, or grief, or yarrow, these are all the natural world. And actually we have found ourselves in a really funny situation where we even have a concept of what nature writing is. And sometimes, I was highly commended for the Wainwright when Thin Places came out, my first book, and I was sent off to do little tourings of seeing my book in all these places. And Thin Places was never in the nature writing section, never once. Sometimes it was in politics, Sometimes it was in biography, sometimes it was in feminism, sometimes it was in self-help, but it's never in the nature section. And I was quietly happy with that, because actually I don't view myself like you as a nature writer. And I also feel like there's a lot of questioning that needs to happen around who gets to write the natural world, and what about all these people who are living through the crisis of the natural world in a much more real, guttural way than what we are, because they've always been writing and they've always been trying to communicate, and they're closer to a lot of the crises that we're kind of beginning now to see coming through. And so I suppose, yeah, there's a really interesting Kathleen Jamie article called The White Enraptured Male, and sometimes the London Review of Books let you read it for free, so you should always try and check it. But you know, this idea that you were just saying about that white male going off into the mountains and leaving his partner, wife likely, to raise their, you know, kids on her own and be this quiet little background thing. And you know, also just in general, you know, where are we moving to with nature writing, and how are we representation really matters. So prizes like the Nan Shepherd Prize are really important. Things like Willow Herb Review, which has just had its last one, but you know, has done great things for this scene. Just expand out like disability, how we view disability even as a word or phrase within ableism and the natural world. And I'm intrigued by the fact you don't, because I wouldn't refer to you as a nature writer either, so it's interesting.
Those were such interesting answers. They do somewhat mess with my questions to hear that you don't think of yourselves as nature writers, but we'll go with this. I mean,
well, we have written about the natural.
So I mean,
connection with nature is very relevant. So.
Yeah, I mean, some of what struck me about both of your books is how new they both felt, and it felt like an experience of reading about something new to me, something that I haven't seen represented within the nature writing genre, or even if maybe that's not where you'd sit yourselves. So I think it's really refreshing and sounds really positive to me that maybe thinking about your writing differently opens up a space for some new voices or new stories that we haven't heard before. Kerri, kind of leading on from that, I was hoping to ask you about the form of your book, because that to me, it felt like I was reading about something new, not just in terms of the topic, but also kind of formally what you were doing with it. So sort of sections of the book are sort of written in quite a fragmented way. There's bits that are like poetry. So I wanted to ask kind of why you decided to write in that form, if it even felt like a choice or just was necessary to kind of break out of those kind of traditional ways of sitting a book in the genre.
Yeah, that's really a lovely question. So Cacophony of Bone spans 12 months. It's the first year of me living where I am, and almost the first year of the pandemic. It begins in December and runs through to December. And each chapter is tripartite in form. So it begins with an essay, has journal, and then ends with an essay, apart from in November, where it doesn't have that, because I always have to kind of have something a bit. Anyway, so that's how I always write. And interestingly, that's how I wrote Thin Places first of all. So Thin Places went through 11 structural edits, which is really unusual for a memoir. And so Thin Places was like how Cacophony of Bone is. It mixed journal entry, it mixed letters, it had text messages in there, it had a lot of poetry, a lot of essays. And actually it went through a lot of different formats. So it was a series of political essays. It was a children's story, then it was political essays, and that's how I write. I write like that. And all of the essays that are online, if anybody's ever read any of my work online, you'll see that generally speaking, like I play around with form, because I feel like form is somewhere where we can invite our reader to actually feel safe within the object that we've created. We can create a space, a womb-like space with work. Because of the pandemic changing our reading habits and our attention span, what I didn't want to do was create a book which was like a tome that just read. Because again, I'm interested in how we can shift the narrative around reader-person relationship person-world relationship, non-human and human, and how the form that we choose to write in can actually lead us into that. So the creation of safe space doesn't just have to be spaces like this where there's hybrid to make people feel safe, but it can also happen on the page. And so I deal in the book with a lot of deep-rooted grief. So there's a lot of stuff within the book about Irish women and their children and what we've been forced to live through. There's a lot of stuff about my own what I've lived through. There's a lot of stuff of what we all lived through during the pandemic. And I was very keenly aware that my book would be one of the first that would come out. It would be the first that would come out with Canigate, my publishers, and one of the first that would come out that would directly address the lived experiences of people living through both the pandemic and also things like the Black Lives Matter movements and a lot of increased ableism, a lot of increased police input into things where it wasn't actually necessary. And I didn't want anyone to feel unsafe in the narrative. So it felt like the only way for me to address climate grief, personal grief, political grief, anxiety around what we were living through was to allow breathing space around the words. It really mattered to me to do that. So yeah.
Another really beautiful answer, thank you. But then for Victoria, so something that I feel like your book opened up for me, talking about kind of representations, whose stories we're hearing, was that it really opened a window into the challenges isn't even the right word, like this just deep unfairness about the social housing system. I don't think I've ever been so angry reading a book as reading about you being forced to give up your chickens. So I was hoping you could tell us a bit more about what it's been like to kind of share some of those experiences.
Those chickens, they're getting their day. I feel like they're getting their sort of, their moment to tell their story. Their names were Rosalita and Flora Ann. So before I say any of this, social housing is absolutely fantastic. We need it. We need more of it. And I will forever be grateful for having the opportunity to have the house that we had and for us to have that safe space financially and the security of it. So all of that is my precursor to anything that I have written and anything I say from this point, because honestly, there should be more. Saying that, like what we didn't have was rental insecurity. So I've rented. I'm 51. I rented all my life, and up until having the house in the housing association, was faced with constant rental insecurity, which is so much worse now. But this is going back to 2012, which again was a time that feels terribly familiar now. That there was a cost of living crisis, there was the drop in availability of work. The word austerity was kind of bandied around, and my family, we reliably created income, so there was a lot of insecurity with that. But the reality of social housing is that there's a lot of bureaucracy that comes with it. There's a lot of regulations. So one of the first things that we faced was we were threatened with, we were sent a letter saying that we with a threat of eviction because we had built a compost out of pallets in the garden. That was the first thing that we did in the garden because I realized that we needed to grow some soil. So, and because we didn't buy a composting, I went and baked some compost, some pallets off the building site, and we strung them together with some rope that we found on the building site, and that was it. And it's in the book, but we got a letter saying we had to remove the rubbish. We had 7 or 14 days to do so, or eviction, proceedings would happen. And I realised that there was the perception of what was rubbish and recycle. So, for example, in the tenant's handbook was over 20 pages long, and it said that they had a ethos of recycling, a green credential, but at the same time they were telling us to get rid of this this pallet compost heap. So I realized at that point that we were going to have issues. We also had to apply for permission to grow the garden in the first place. And there were regulations about what we could do, and the stipulation that we had to destroy the garden when we moved. We left in November last year, and the garden exists in the book, but it doesn't exist now anywhere else. It had to be completely destroyed, which again is upsetting, but at the same time, the principle behind it is that each person that moves in, it should be their home, and it should be their space that they can create. So I've understood it in that it's their beginning. So a new family are living there with a young child, and they will make their own garden, and that's fine. I also know that seeds come back. And we moved in the winter. So that is the reality of it, that we thought it would be our, it's a terribly naff term, but our forever home. We moved there to raise our child. We thought that was the closest we could get to the security, because it didn't have the same insecure tenancy thing. We realized very quickly that we couldn't be the people that we are in that space, that there would always be a tension between that. And that taught me something very, very clear about the privilege of owning the ground that you live in. And it also taught my son that. So the chicken chapter, my son learned at a very young age that those people who could own their houses on the same estate could have chickens, but we couldn't, even though the reasoning for not being able to have them was that they would introduce rats, apparently. So, and he said to me, if we had enough money to buy our own house, could I have chickens then? Well, yes. The next question was, will we ever have enough money to buy our own house? And he learned that then, at that age. And that was the thing I was most angry about. And that's where I'm going to end on it, because I didn't go on and on and on and talk about the chickens. But it was the thing I was most upset about, was that as a child, I was trying to raise him in a way that would teach him an inclusive way of living, and to have compassion and kindness. And he was taught through bureaucracy that there was actually a difference between those who had and those who didn't have. And I thought that was too young to learn that, and I couldn't undo it. So there.
Hope everyone else is as curious as I am hearing you talk about it even now. So something else that I wanted to ask both of you about, just keeping on the time, and mindful again that you don't want to pigeonhole yourselves as nature writers, but something else that felt very new to me was, I'm really familiar with reading about kind of more individual encounters with the natural world, with that one-to-one relationship. And what really stood out in both your books was the kind of wider relationships that play there. So you had people sending, both of you I think had people sending you seeds and letters through the post. And I was curious what both of you think about bringing those kind of wider relationships, a wider sense of community kind of onto the page, particularly I suppose in relation to the natural world.
Yeah, another really great question. And yeah, I feel like the more we can live into and lean back into community, the more chance we have of changing this world for the better. And I suppose that the more we see ourselves and our experience reflected on the page, the more we understand that we belong. And so I suppose the more non-human we see on the page, the more we understand that they belong too. And so there's a coexistence. And yeah, I think that's all to say.
I have terrible brain fog, so by the time it gets to me, I've forgotten what your question is. I think that, our garden was created, like I said, through weeds that we dug out of where they would be destroyed. I always say to people, don't go around digging up wildflowers wherever you find them. These were things that would have been destroyed by the building site anyway. But it was also created through donations of friends and family, and the things that people threw out. But something that struck me in the process of creating that space for us to live in and that space for me to grieve in, and a space for my son to grow in, was that none of that was done on my own. And grief can feel very, for me, grief felt very isolating. It felt like there was me and there was everybody else. And I so needed people to reach out and walk with me and hold on to me. But I couldn't be soft, and I couldn't be pliable, and I couldn't be fluffy. And grief isn't easy. And in the garden, I found a space, and in that natural world, I found a space where I felt supported both by the ground, literally, by the Mother of Earth, and also by the people around me that started to be part of that gardening. So the garden became a storytelling as well. It became as much of a memoir as the book that is written. It became a conversation. And by the time, the book was written over 10 years as well, so it has a span of 10 years. And that was important to me. But so did the garden, and the garden started to tell its stories, and it was made by all these different people. So I think that we are community. We can't, it's this thing about, we talk about biodiversity like it's something out there and that we're not part of it. So, biodiversity. It's like we are part of that biodiversity. So that's, the concept of biodiversity is this sort of is community, is these habitats, is this connection between everything. And it's not a connection between people and nature. It's just a connection that we're all part of. So I think that's me where it is.
I love that way of you're both talking about it as sort of breaking down the space between sort of people and community, and then more broadly the sort of natural world as all being coexisting in that same community. So we have about 20 minutes left. So Kerri, I know you were going to read for us as well. So if you're happy to do a reading now, then we can take some audience questions afterwards.
Before we go into questions, I just want to say thank you so much, Rhiannon, for your questions, and thank you for coming, and thank you to Mary for having us, and to all of you for coming. Okay. After writing my first book, I promised myself to put grief away and to never ever lift it back out again. I swore blind I'd give it no more room in my days, my work, my world. I had sickened myself with it, as they say. Recently I read that we might know as writers when the work is ready, and that this moment might be as soon as we feel we cannot even look at it anymore. It seems that might be how I am with my material. As soon as I've reached saturation point, as soon as I never want to hear the word again, only then should I actually be allowed to write about the thing at hand. The blue hydrangea we carried from the bogside in the heart of Derry, to a concrete yard of an old shirt factory, to the waterside, then to this central bogland of Ireland, have died. Someone I cared for so deeply, but who reciprocated with pain, loves hydrangea, and I have spent the best part of a year wondering how it's possible to still love something that still holds such devastating memories for you. How to love a plant that always makes you think of a person who did not love you back. How to love a plant that makes you think of all the things that have been thrown at you. How still to love a thing that holds your trauma in its very roots. A poet I so deeply admire tweets an Emily Dickinson quote about mud, and I am rapt, taken by the words in ways I struggle to make sense of. I Google gardening Emily Dickinson, and the first return is an iconic image of her, black and white, the flower in her hands ginkgo yellow, although I instantly recognize it as hydrangea. To the left, the following words. In her own time, she was better known for her hydrangeas. The article goes on to tell me that fewer than a dozen of her poems were published before her death. The people living close to the poet would have known her as a gardener, in fact. A solitary woman by lantern light, tending to her garden dressed in white. I was reared in the garden, you know, she wrote before she turned 30. Yes, I think. This is the way the world should work. I want to rear my child in a garden. I want to rear myself and want to let the muck and dirt get in under my skin and fix things. I want to start loosening myself from the hold of a past that does not serve me, that never did. My lover comes into our bedroom. I'm tucked in beneath the sheet already, bone tired from the garden, and tells me, as if it was the thing of most importance in all the world, Emily Dickinson was a gardener. He tells me that her poem, There Is Another Sky, written for her brother, holds the garden up as a bringer of hope in hard times. He's heard this on the radio just before bed, and it struck him as something he knows will touch me. So he carries the words in one hand, a mug of pucka nighttime tea in the other. I fall asleep listening to Josephine Foster sing the words of that poet gardener, with the window wide open to my own garden, my first garden, the place I shall think of always when I hear the word garden. To tend to a garden is to remove, to take away so much more than we could ever imagine, to make room for all that still will come. Growing is about order, about the intentional clearing of space by cutting things back. To tend a garden is to free ourselves from the things we long have known should have no place in our lives and in our days and in our gardens. I wish I'd known long before now that sowing is a way to grieve. As hands scatter seeds into earth beneath feet, they are really sculpting loss. With careful, repeated movements, the hands are moulding it into a thing like light on stone. Trees sway softly in a breeze only just there. I realise as I navigate my current dream that this garden, the one of which I'm dreaming, is my everything. This garden is those nests that came to me and stayed, that light that came and stayed. This garden, no matter how different it looks in this dream, is the garden right outside my door. This garden is the making of me, and don't I know it?
That was so beautiful. Yeah, you read as well as write beautifully. And now I think, are there any questions from the audience?
The question from Sarah. Both of your books describe the process of tending to a garden as a way of being in dialogue with grief. How has the process of tending to your words while writing these books affected that dialogue or the tone of the conversation you're having?
That's a good question, Sarah. The process of writing the book and the gardening was at the same time. So, like I said, it was over 10 years, and there was a conversation going on between the garden that I was growing and the words that I was growing. So, just as I learned more about the plants that were growing in that space and learned about their healing properties and their folklore and their history and their character, I also learned about my own grief, I actually found life in that rather than the loss. So I wrote about my sister and her loss. I really don't like the word with loss with it, but my sister drowned. That's the big grief that starts this book. My sister drowned, and I wrote into her story. I wrote into our story, and I wrote into the story of my relationships with the important women in my life, my sisters, my mother, my friends, people that were no longer there that I wanted to keep alive and plant in the story. So my words are that garden, and there's a lot of stones in there, and there's a lot of things growing, and I don't know if the two things are the same.
And you do that so beautifully in your book. Yeah, great question about grief and gardening and the words. And actually, at the very end, in the acknowledgements of Cacophony of Bone, I do quite an unusual thing, and I thank the book. And it felt a bit weird to do it, but then it felt really weird not to do it, because actually I feel like Cacophony of Bone, so it's about that first year of the pandemic, but it was written, unlike Victoria's, which was written over 10 years, mine was written over 3 months. Experiencing extreme postnatal depression, very, very difficult, very, very dark winter. And basically I say in the book that my only responsibility out with mothering that winter was these words, and I'm confident that the words acted much in the same way as the garden, and that they held me, and they were a way to sculpt that grief and to grow. That's a really good question.
I actually have a follow-on question from that. So bearing in mind what you just said, was it difficult going through 12 rounds of edits?
For thin places, it was really difficult. It was memoir. You probably get asked this a lot as well. Memoir writers, especially female memoir writers, always get asked, was it very cathartic? And it never is. Like, it's never. Like, no, don't even never ask someone that question, because it isn't. It's a form of excavation of pain, so it's triggering. It's revisiting of trauma. With an interesting thing, I don't know what happened, but with Cacophony of Bone, there was like only really one round of edits, and it was odd things. And I said this at my Portobello Books event. It was like my editor took out one single line about a cow, just took it out for no, and I've no idea why, but actually that felt really good that I didn't have to do all those edits again. But editing's great, isn't it? It's a really great thing. It's like weeding.
I forgot your question again.
Yeah, I was just asking Kerri about this. She mentioned that she's gone through so many amounts of that. Any other questions from people who are here or online?
Let me try jump on in. I'll check online again.
But sort of like
I think there's some. I mean, the title of my book is All My Wild Mothers, so that I've got mothers and motherhood in the book. On the front cover. And there is for me, there was a relationship between that idea of the women who had mothered me. They weren't necessarily my mother, and I mean, my mother is in it, but they were the women who had nurtured me and the women who had held me and mothered me through my life, including the adult women in my adult life. And it was also about my relationship with my child. And in writing it, I had to face a lot of kind of questions about what is a mother, what am I, I didn't feel like I should be a mother. And for a long time I felt that, because a mother was a certain thing and I wasn't that. So a mother was gentle and kind and stable and, all of these things. That wasn't my mother either. I mean, my mother was wonderful actually, but not those things. But I had this perceived notion, and then I couldn't mother. I had pregnancy loss and conception difficulties conceiving, and so I decided that I didn't deserve to be a mother. That there was something wrong in me. That I was rotten. I was broken. I couldn't be the ground that nurtured a child into being. And then my sister died 2 months before I became a mother, 2 months before my son was born. So again, there was that conflict between motherhood and life and death. So those two things have actually existed hand in hand through my journey with motherhood. Grief and motherhood, death and life. And I think that the ground is, for me, the greatest teacher of those two things sitting together. So it brings life, it takes life, I start waving my hands a lot. I think the role of mothering is not specific to giving birth, is what I'm trying to say in that. And the relationship with the ground is not necessarily a feminine one, because I gardened with my son and I was very conscious that I had a male child, but that one I was when he was born. I was raising a man. Now, whether he chooses to carry on his life that way, I don't know, because his life is his life, but I was very conscious of it. And his world, when he was small and growing up, was about mothering the earth and being mothered by the earth. So I don't think it's a gender, but it is a feminine thing, because we quantify femininity often, or qualify femininity with the idea of nurture.
Yeah, that's a brilliant question, and it really, really matters to me how we represent motherhood, so the otherhood of motherhood. And I've just recently come back from a really amazing conference at Tate's Ives, using Barbara Hepworth's work as a way into these other voices by creative people who've explored pregnancy loss, or infertility, or loss of a child, or childless not by choice, or childless by choice, or mothers who don't feel the way we've been kind of spoon-fed that we're meant to be. And that was an incredibly moving experience. Now, very moving for me in the way that what I realised was, the panelists, all of us who presented our pieces, we all used the natural world as a means into the grief, or the pain, or the anxiety that we were holding within us. So a group of childless, not by choice women had come together, and they'd created a choral piece. So they sang in a rock pool at dawn and dusk to work through their grief. A woman who'd lost her son, her only son, when he was a teenager, had used microscopic images of when she was scattering his ashes into the Atlantic Ocean, and had found great comfort in that. I looked at my garden and how I'd used that as a means through another person who's childless not by choice, Jodie Day, who's incredible, and who spearheaded Gateway Women, so families who can't have children. She used the concept of a hagstone. So all of us at the same time were living through this experience of, mother is a word older than mourner. So when you look at old dialogue of our words, where they come from, universally, the word mother is older. So we've given it that importance for so long, but yet we won't let it grow. The word is begging us to grow, to let it grow. It just wants to be what it wants to be. And there are actually women in the audience who've mothered me in more meaningful ways than the person who gave birth to me. And it's important that we talk about that. And your son mothered the earth. And Irene Sola, in this incredible book, When I Sing Mountains Dance, if you haven't read it, read it, buy it to everybody you can. There's this bit, so basically she's a nature writer, but she's not, and she talks about there are these spirits, there are these mountain spirits, and there's a lot of mothering and non-mothering and unborn and born in it. And there's this bit where there are mushrooms, and there are spirits, and there are women, and one of the lines is, "We are all mothers here." And it just blew my mind. It changed everything about how I viewed the natural world. And, you know, obviously like people like Robin Wall Kimmerer have been looking at what it means to mother in this climate through which we're living, and how Lucy Jones has an incredible book coming out soon called Matri. She wrote Lisa Needham, and she's looking at how Matri Essence is the process of becoming a mother, and all the changes that happen in a person. And I didn't know anything about it, really. You know, this concept of all these changes that we're not told about and what that means for us as a race. And I don't think it's too far of a push to believe that if we engage properly and openly with this word, mother, we will save each other. We will save this planet. And
Is there another audience question? While you're having a think, Polly Atkin has asked, yeah, Polly, would love to know about Vic's editing process too.
Okay. Yeah, I didn't actually have too many edits, although there were a few editors. So just because of the circumstances, it went through different editors in its journey. But because I think I'd spent a long time writing it, by the time it went to the publishing process, it was quite ready. So yeah, rather like a bit more than just a cow left, but a couple of chapters didn't make it, and I can see now it's like, yeah, that's right. But I changed the structure. Was an interesting one in the editing process, because for quite a while I was writing, couldn't quite get it, and I realized I was trying to structure it in a linear way. I was thinking of it in a linear way. So although there is a timeline in it, it does move backwards and forwards. I personally think we experience memory in the present tense anyway, so I don't think we do have the backwards and forwards. But I changed. I woke up one day and went, no, it needs to be a labyrinth. And drew a giant labyrinth on the only flat space I had, which was a wardrobe in the house. On a piece of paper, covered it with paper, drew a giant labyrinth and started a mad post-it note thing. Terrified my editor probably, and also meant that we couldn't get to our clothes for quite a while. I had to edit the book quite quickly because we couldn't change. And also our room was very small, so every time I walked past it, I would grab a post-it note with my butt, which meant that sometimes it got edited by me taking chapters out to the supermarket and leaving them there. So I don't know what people thought of me walking around with things like nettle stuck to my butt. So yeah, it was a very physical process of editing.
I love that. So one last burning question here, yeah, and then if you can repeat the question for those online into the microphone, Rihanna.
Struggle to make it a linear process. How have you found that, like, time, garden, stick nature, or the writing just how it goes here? How it's affected? So I think that was long, but I think I got this right. So just bearing in mind that it was difficult to write, or you realised you didn't want to write it in a linear way, just the kind of cyclical nature of the year and being in the garden had an impact on the way that you were writing.
Yeah, it was really important to me that what I was writing was as authentic as possible in terms of my experience of grief as well. So I really didn't want to create something that was, here is a challenge, here is a trauma, here is something, here is a garden, I'm all better now. Life's really happy and I'm living in Eden, which I literally was actually living in Eden. That was the valley that I lived in. And my husband's called Adam. So that cyclical process of the garden helped me with my own grief, but also in the writing of it, I wanted to make sure that was there, that you go through it and you find that things do regrow and things die off and things regrow. So one of the comments that was said to me in the editing process was that it was I've not done this before, so I didn't know. It was like, it was quite radical to have like the big happy moment in the middle and then something else goes wrong. It's like, oh no, that's apparently quite unusual. I'm like, oh, okay, know that. But that's life, isn't it? We have these high points, we have these things, and that was really, really important that those two things sat together, that we have fallow times, we have dark times, we have high times, and we have growth times. And we need to remember all of those, keep going and keep going and keep going.
Yeah, gorgeous. Yeah, we don't, time is a completely invented concept. Like, I think that's all we really need to say. I mean, like, we live in circles. So in particular as women, and there's a bit in my book where I look at a bone. I won't wreck it, but it's about the marking of time and women are more naturally, maybe particularly impacted on by particular parts of this earth in which we live because of the moon and because of the tides and things. But I do believe that all of us have the ability to just step outside of the flow that we've been put in and remember that actually it's all invented, and that's for everything. So the more we live by the cycles and the seasons, the more in tune we are with ourselves, the more in tune we are with the key that are around us, and the more chance we have of making this place fairer and safer. And I suppose I really wanted to bring that into my work, in particular after what we've lived through on our government responses to such a difficult time. And I feel like words hold power in a way that we really have to let them hold power. And I think that listening, the act of really properly listening to one another, holding space for the grief and the anxiety, is a way to carve and sculpt the world that we need to live in.
So I think that's us at time. So thanks so much to both of you for being here and for such thoughtful and interesting conversation. Both of their books are available in the bookshop. They're both excellent and absorbing, and I would encourage everybody to go and just immediately buy both of them. But first, if you could just join me in thanking Kerri and Victoria again.